It's Monday, February 27th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Senate Staff Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Washington, D.C. with Mr. Randy Nuckolls. Randy is a double dog, earning both his BSA and JD from the University of Georgia. Before beginning a long, successful career in law and governmental affairs, Randy served on the Senate staffs of both Herman Talmadge and Sam Nunn. He is currently a partner at Denton's Washington, D.C. office, where he's a member of its public policy practice. And last but not least, he is a member in good standing of the Richard B. Russell Foundation. Randy, thank you so much, of course, for hosting us, as always, here in Washington. It makes things much easier on our end.
Glad to be able to help.
But also to take the time out this afternoon to talk about your time working for Sam Nunn. Mm-hmm. So before we begin talking about that, remind us where you grew up and how Randy Nuckolls got from his hometown in Georgia to the nation's capital.
Okay. I grew up in Whitfield County, a little community called Tunnel Hill, Georgia, on a farm, a poultry and dairy farm there. I was big in the 4-H programs in Georgia. That's probably what took me beyond Whitfield County. I was a good student in school, in high school, and went to Dalton Junior College as a first-year student. I had a scholarship that year, $300 for the year, and the tuition for the year was $270. So I got $30 back for books that first year. But all my friends, I had worked after my senior year in high school at Rock Eagle 4-H Center as a camp counselor. So a lot of my 4-H friends from around the state of Georgia were at UGA. And so I told my parents if I got some additional scholarship money for my sophomore year, I was going to go to UGA. And I cobbled together, I had a scholarship. I worked again that summer, second summer at Rock Eagle. I cobbled together a College of Agriculture scholarship, Georgia Poultry Federation scholarship. My dad worked in the poultry industry, and I got one of the big leadership scholarships from they were offered by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in those days. One boy and one girl from every of the big 6 districts for 4-H in the state of Georgia, and so I got one of those for North Georgia. And with those 3 scholarships, I was able to have enough money plus what I'd saved to go transfer to UGA. So I loaded up my car and drove to Athens.
So your parents, you grew up on a farm and everything. Were your parents supportive of you going to university, or were you expected to sort of follow along in the footsteps of an agricultural career?
Well, I don't think they prescribed anything that I should do. They were proud of me. They were proud of my achievements in high school, my achievements in 4-H, and I was the first. None of my parents' generation in our family had college degrees. I was the oldest grandchild on my mother's side and one of the older ones on my dad's side, and I was the first to have a college degree, and certainly the first to have a law degree. So I got to UGA, I reconnected with all my 4-H friends. I got involved in the student organizations at UGA, the Collegiate 4-H Club. I became a senator. I was in the agriculture school, College of Agriculture. I at one point thought I wanted to be a county extension agent, I guess for my 4-H background. Then I enrolled in agricultural economics, and about halfway through the first quarter, I got a call from, the Office of Instruction at the College of Agriculture saying, you have a poultry science scholarship. You're supposed to be enrolled in the poultry science department. And so I had to transfer into poultry science for the rest of that year. I actually was a student work study for a professor in poultry science, I remember, a guy named Professor Dindy. And so I finished that year in poultry science taking general ag classes, and I transferred back to ag economics for my junior year and started taking as many classes as I could in the business school as well.
Right.
So I took accounting and marketing over on North Campus in the business school. Took other courses, of course, on North Campus. And I guess I was a good student there. Got involved in a variety of student organizations, student senator from the College of Agriculture, was vice president of the Ag Hill Council, ended up being chosen as the outstanding senior in the College of Agriculture my senior year. And I wasn't really ready to leave Athens. I was a good student and I liked student leadership organizations, and so I applied to grad school and law school. And finally, my last quarter of my senior year, the winter quarter, I worked in the Georgia General Assembly as an intern and worked for the House Agriculture Committee. And so I applied to grad school and law school and finally decided that a lot of people I saw in the community had law degrees that were leaders in the community, maybe. So I thought, well, that would be a way to keep me in Athens, and so I went to Georgia Law School.
So at what point, because everything up to this is the way.
Well, I just thought that law school kept my options open, I guess. I saw people of different career paths that had law degrees. I remember there was a sports commentator, you're not old enough to remember very well, but Howard Cosell was a well-known sports commentator.
Howard Cosell.
Yeah. And he called a lot of competitive team sports, but he was famous for boxing matches and famous for jawing with Muhammad Ali in some of those interviews. Anyway, he was a lawyer, and I was like, okay, he can do that and be a sports commentator. I can be a lawyer and do a lot of different things.
Okay.
And so I went to law school. I was still connected to the ag school. I was president of the Blue Key organization on campus when I was in law school. I was president of Agon, the top honor for ag and forestry students, vet med students on South Campus while I was in law school. And it was through that Agon I guess presidency that when I was president, we gave an award to Senator Talmadge. He came to our breakfast meeting in the fall of my third year of law school, I guess, or second year of law school. Anyway, I was the presiding officer, and he and Rogers Wade came to that breakfast meeting and noticed me. And later, when Jimmy Carter went to the White House, in January of '77, he took with him Dan Tate, who had been Talmadge's senior lawyer on Talmadge's staff, and that opened a slot in Senator Talmadge's office for a young lawyer. And they reached out to me and said, we noticed you, and you have an ag background, and Senator Talmadge is chairman of the Agriculture Committee, and would you be interested in coming to Washington? We've read about your leadership on campus. And so I flew up and interviewed, and they offered me a job, and I had to change course. I was going back to my hometown of Dalton, home county seat. I'd been a summer law clerk in one of the big firms in Dalton, big for Dalton, 10 lawyers. I didn't know what to do about withdrawing from accepting my offer, which I had accepted in the fall of my third year of law school. And so I called the district attorney in town, a guy named Charlie Pannell, who was kind of a mentor for me, and I said, what should I do? He had been in that law firm before he became district attorney. And I was afraid to tell them that I was going to break my commitment to join them, because they only hired someone every 2 or 3 years, and now it was past the hiring season for replacing me if I went to Washington. And so Charlie said, I'm going to go talk to Robert. He was talking about Robert Vining, who was then the Superior Court judge and later a federal judge, who died recently, actually, in his early 90s. And he said, in a couple of days, Charlie called me back and he said, Robert and I say you should go work for Senator Talmadge. We'll go tell the law firm you're not coming to work for them. So that's what happened. And I wrote the law firm and later, and I said, I was very grateful for your offer to work for you, and I hope when I come home in a couple of years from Washington, if you have an opening, you'll consider me again in the future. And of course, it's been more than 40 years, and here I am in Washington. But I've kept touch with my Georgia roots, and I think the partners in that law firm were all, over time, very proud of the fact that their guy was working on Capitol Hill for the senior senators from Georgia.
So, remind us, what positions did you hold on Senator Talmadge's staff during those years?
Well, I started with Talmadge. He always had two lawyers. The senior guy, in those days we didn't have a title called legislative director, but that's what they're called now, and then the junior guy. And so Dan Tate was the senior guy for several years for Senator Talmadge. He went to be Jimmy Carter's Senate liaison, so the guy that ran interference and liaison work for the president with the members of the U.S. Senate. Russell King, who was the junior guy, moved up to be the senior legislative person, and I was hired. So, and we had other staff. We had, in those days, you didn't have a job like they have now called legislative correspondent, but we had secretaries that would answer the mail, and you had something that hadn't been seen in a long time called memory typewriters, and they would store 50 discrete letters or paragraphs, and my job for the first year with Senator Talmadge was basically answering mail. And now anything that there's this large volume of form letters, we would call them, we would send those off to another building from the Russell building and say these all get the same response, and they would be printed out on a printer, a robo machine, and then signed by the auto pen and sent back to constituents. But if they were individual letters and not the same, then the legislative office, we would answer them all. And Senator Talmadge and Senator Nunn later were very strict about wanting their letters answered promptly. And so I would originally sit there with a dictaphone and dictate answers to letters that had come into Senator Talmadge.
Another old-fashioned word.
Dictaphone, yeah. Right. Or I would put on a letter, give this paragraph 3, 17, and 42. And number 3 might have been the opening paragraph to a letter, and then number 17 might have been a subject matter, whatever the constituent wrote about. Right. The Farm Bill or labor law reform or some major issue.
The Panama Canal.
The Panama Canal. Well, the Panama Canal Treaty was probably something that was so much volume it went over for.
That's actually true. I mean, we have just boxes and boxes of the form cards that would have come in. So,
now, but if there were multiple issues in the same letter, that's the ones that stayed for us to customize the letter.
Right.
And so I would either dictate a response to something, or I would know that we had these 50 paragraphs, and if I wrote the 3 paragraphs, then Mary Jane Eisel, this sweet little lady who she'd worked in the Senate for a long time, she used to tell me stories about Jack Kennedy coming down to her office to talk to her boss. I can't remember now who her senator was. It wasn't before Senator Talmadge, but how Kennedy would come and sit in her office and talk to her, and then wait on her boss to and visit with her boss. So she was great because she had worked in the Senate since the 50s.
Right.
And so it was good to hear her tell stories. But I would hear Mary Jane, she'd get one letter, and the memory typewriter would be on, a big red typewriter, electric typewriter, and she would turn a dial to number 3, and it'd go, and the first paragraph would type out, and then she'd turn the dial to the next paragraph, it would come out, and so, and then it would create a letter, just as if you were cutting and pasting from a computer now, cutting and pasting words out of different documents. You just didn't have a cut and paste, you just had to type it out. It was an original typed letter. Now, kids today would see a memory typewriter or even a manual typewriter and say, wow, this is an incredible machine. You can see it on the page as soon as I hit the key, instead of waiting to print the whole thing out at one time. And so that was the way we answered the mail, individualized mail, and that's what I did for the first year of my life in Senator Talmadge's office.
And you graduated from mail guy to...
Well, I graduated from the junior LA to the legislative director a year later. And the last 2 years of his career, I was his chief counsel and legislative director.
So when we wrap up with Senator Talmadge, what's your, let's call it your favorite memory of your time working in Senator Talmadge's office for those years?
I had some incredible experiences where I was deputized by him to do his work, particularly in the Senate Finance Committee. Now, he had a whole staff in the Agriculture Committee, so even though I had an ag background, I was not doing the ag work because he was chairman of the Ag Committee, so he had a whole staff there doing agriculture work. But I was his guy the last 2 years, as was Russell King and Dan Tate before me, being his person either in supporting him when he was in the committee meeting, or if he wasn't there, we were given the proxy his vote. If he had left a proxy, I would have it in my pocket. And if Chairman Long, Russell Long was the chairman, or later Bob Packwood was the chairman, then Talmadge, I could, if he happened to be there because he was over in an ag committee meeting or because he had gone home early, then they would call a vote. This was in the days when you actually had lots of votes in the committees and markups of bills. For some bills would be marked up for weeks.
Another old-fashioned word.
Marked up at weeks at a time. You would have full-day sessions in the committee meeting, or at least several hours before the afternoon when you would have votes on the floor of the Senate, so you didn't have the committee's meeting. And if he wasn't there, I mean, I remember once that there was a vote on the windfall profits tax legislation, and Lloyd Benson from Texas had offered an amendment to give some extra tax credits to what were called stripper wells that were about to be depleted out in the oil fields, and there was an additional tax incentive to get the last oil out of that well, and Benson had offered an amendment to provide that extra tax incentive, and it lost on like an 8-9 vote in the morning markup. And they adjourned for lunch, and they came back, and Benson amended and watered down the benefit of the tax incentive with the hope that it could pass a less generous version would pass. Now, Senator Talmadge had promised President Carter that he would support the administration's positions on the windfall profits tax. It was Carter's, after all, Carter's proposal to impose more taxes on the oil and gas industry for their windfall profits. And so Talmadge had pretty much pledged to the president he would support the president's initiative. But Talmadge was also very loyal to Chairman Long, his best buddy in the Senate. Talmadge had gone home that day. He had a bad sore throat and cold, and he went home. And I had the proxy. And the vote that afternoon, there was some debate, and I thought, well, if he was here, he might support the change, the new version. Immediately after the vote, it was tied, and there were like 3 of us that our bosses weren't there. And immediately Senator Longstaff, Senator Dole, Senator Benson, everybody from the oil producing states, and particularly Chairman Long and Ranking Member Bob Dole, wanted the proxy. And so their staff came to me, and I said, if I vote the proxy, I have to vote against you, because Senator Talmadge left the proxy with me that vote with the administration, and the administration was opposed to the Benson Amendment. And finally I told Senator Dole's guys, I said, I won't vote for right now. I'll give you a few minutes. I'm not going to, they said, could you just not vote? And I said, all right, I won't vote right now. And I went back in the back room of the committee meeting, out of the public eye, and there's a big table in the back room at the Finance Committee. And Bob Dole came back there, and he saw me, and he grabbed me by the arm, and he said, where's Herman? And I said, well, Senator Dole, he's gone home. He's not feeling well. And he said, well, I need to talk to Herman. And I went in a little phone booth in that back room, and I called Senator Talmadge at his home. And I was trying to explain to him what had transpired, the dynamics of it. And he said, vote me with the president. I said, vote me with the president. And so I hung up, and I came back out, and Senator Dole came over to me again. And he said, I need to talk to Herman. And I said, okay, Senator Dole. I said, if you tell him that I gave you this phone number, he may fire me. But I gave Senator Dole Senator Talmadge's home phone number, and he went into the phone booth himself, and he called Senator Talmadge. And he came out of the phone booth, and he said, Herman says for you not to vote. So I didn't vote, and they rounded up the other votes in favor of the Benson Amendment, and it passed. And those kind of, there were other, that's just one example of other examples where on a airline tax or something where you would have lobbyists sitting in the room, and you might have Delta Airlines sitting in the room, and you know what their position, what we wanted to always try to help our home state airlines. You had to always know that somebody was watching, and sometimes you were making a decision on the spur of the moment when your boss wasn't there.
Right.
And that was pretty heady stuff for a 26-year-old at the time.
Especially with the knowledge that nobody elected you
right.
to do anything.
Right. Right.
So,
but what you ask about, what I always really, my lasting feelings about Senator Talmadge are that he never mistreated me. He always treated me with respect. He always backed me up if anything that I had done. Now, in private, if he didn't like something maybe, or the way I drafted a letter or something, then maybe he might tell me that. But he also, he wasn't overly generous with just compliments, but a couple of times when they came, they were very meaningful. And he never undercut you in public.
Right.
Whereas I saw lots of other senators berate a staff person and say, well, that wasn't, I didn't do that, my staff guy did it, kind of thing.
Sure.
And so I respected that he treated his staff, he appreciated what you did for him, and he always would back you up.
Now, was there anything that happened in those years that you would like to forget, or at least that you're comfortable telling to me and recording for posterity?
Well, I mean, we had some tough times when I didn't see much of Senator Talmadge's alcoholism.
Right.
It never, in my opinion, really affected his work in the Senate. Mm-hmm. He was probably known to have had kind of weekend binges with alcohol until all the way back to his college days.
Right.
There was this myth, I don't know if it's true or not, he never would confirm, that he got caught in the sorority house up on the second level, he and some buddies in some sorority house, and jumped off when his dad was governor, and he jumped out off the second story balcony and broke his ankle, so he didn't get caught while the governor's son was caught in the sorority house when he was young. And there were other, I mean, there were times. It was only toward the right in the late 70s, after Bobby died, his son died, and after he and Betty divorced, where he was going home and drinking himself to sleep probably. But he would still get up in the morning and run in combat boots at 4 in the morning. And if I smelled his cigar in the hallway in the Russell building at 7 in the morning, I knew he was already there. Didn't get there early enough to beat him there. He was already there. But there were some situations toward the end where, and to his great credit, when there was kind of an intervention with Wilbur Mills helping and John Stennis helping and Rogers Wade and others went to, after Senator Talmadge ended up in the hospital at Walter Reed, when they confronted him and basically said, you need to get some treatment. He didn't object to that and went out to California to the Naval Hospital and had the treatment for 6 weeks and came back and to my knowledge never had another drink of alcohol in his life.
Right.
And that saved his life and extended his life dramatically. And then he had some wonderful post-Senate years after he married Linda.
Right. And
they had a very happy time, and he was able to have closure with some of his good friends. And Linda could talk about when Russell Long came to see him the last time, and he and Zell Miller kind of made up after the Zell ran against him in 1980, and so he had a good life at the end, and he was so respected in the Senate. He was so no nonsense,
yeah.
And the staff guys of the Finance Committee would love it when Senator Long would leave. I mean, they loved Senator Long, but Senator Long was rambled around, and he was a master of pulling people together, but he was not efficient at running a committee meeting. It would kind of, and he would leave for some reason, and Senator Talmadge, the vice chair of the committee, would then take the gavel, and they loved it because Senator Talmadge would just bang things through, and even no objection, so approved, and move on, you know. And Talmadge was not much about small talk, or just socializing,
So, what was the transition like then from Herman Talmadge's office to Sam Nunn's office? How did that happen, and then what was it like making the transition in offices and office culture?
Well, we, of course, like everybody in Georgia, not everybody, but most everybody in Georgia, were shocked that Talmadge lost.
Sure.
It was only the last month after he decisively defeated Zell Miller in the Democratic primary runoff. Everybody assumed that he would be reelected, and then Georgia was changing. Ronald Reagan was running strong, and the last month we realized we probably needed to be more aggressive in our campaign advertising. We didn't. Russell King convinced him, among other people, not to debate Mac Mattingly. Russell would now say that was a big mistake.
Sure.
But he didn't, and Russell and I raised another couple of $100,000 up here in the last month before the election, but some of it couldn't be deployed, frankly.
Right.
It's too late to do the campaign buy.
Right.
And we went to bed. We were at the Colony Square Hotel that night, the election night. Tommy Irvin, the Commissioner of Agriculture, came and declared Talmadge had won. George Busby came to the campaign headquarters. The first edition of the Atlanta paper said Talmadge won. And at 5 o'clock that morning, some late votes in Cobb County came in. Computers or whatever had broken down, and some of it was also
in Columbus.
Georgia, right? And so it pushed Mattingly ahead, and I was sharing a room with another Talmadge staffer, a guy named Bobby Avery, and the radio alarm went off, and the radio announcer said that Mattingly's pulled ahead, and we couldn't believe it. And we all jumped up. We jumped up out of bed, and everybody convened down at Lovejoy or Hampton at Senator Talmadge's house.
Right.
And that was a tough day. Senator Talmadge did not come back to Washington after his defeat. The Senate was still in session that year, and I remember working on some projects for him. I remember one specific instance where he was a conferee on a tax bill in the Finance Committee with the Ways and Means Committee. And because he was a senior Democrat next to the chairman, Russell Long, I sat next to the chairman's guy behind the members in the big, huge Ways and Means Committee room. And we had worked on some, we were pretty early. Before it was cool, we were working on bioenergy and alternative energy and providing tax credits.
Yeah.
And he had offered some tax credit amendments on bioenergy. And they got to that section of the conference, and the Joint Tax Committee staff guys who didn't like some of these provisions had rewritten them in a way that basically gutted the amendment. It was 2 amendments. And I realized when Chairman Long asked the staff guy in the Joint Tax Committee to explain the revised version that they had agreed to between the House and Senate, that it basically just gutted the amendments both. And I was sitting there, and Senator Talmadge wasn't there to raise an objection. And so I leaned over to Russell Long's guy and I said, would you get Chairman Long to ask this question about the changes? And he wrote a note out to Senator Long, gave it to Senator Long. Senator Long asked the question, and the staff guy for the Joint Tax Committee had to admit that it undermined, the way it had been written, basically made the Senator Talmadge's provision of no value to the bioenergy. And Senator Long said, I don't think that's what Herman wanted us to do. And so they changed it, and I saved part of the amendment, and I could see out in this big room in the audience, I could see the lobbyists that had worked on all that. When it first was announced, he just went white as a sheet, because he knew like I knew that it had been gutted. And we saved part of it, even though Senator Talmadge wasn't there. So we were working on things, and there was a big labor bill. What happened is Senator Nunn called me a couple of weeks after the election. He had an interim situation in his office. He did not have a legislative director. A guy named Doug Kidd was functioning as legislative director. Doug and I were classmates at Georgia Law School. Great, and to any business group in Georgia, Doug and Randy were the 2 guys you dealt with in the senator's offices and on business issues for the state of Georgia. And we worked well together. He was a great guy. For whatever reason, there was some view among some of the other staffers in Senator Nunn's office that they didn't want Doug to become the legislative director. So there was kind of there was no legislative director. And Senator Nunn called me, and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going, I think, back to Georgia to practice law. I had interviewed, I think, with King and Spalding at that point. It was the only firm I'd talked to. And he said, come over here and talk to me. So I went over to see Senator Nunn, and we sat down, and he said, you've been recommended. He knew me, but he didn't know me well. But some of his former staff persons, Connell Stafford, Gordon Giffen, had recommended that Nunn hire me to be Nunn's new legislative director. And so he made me an offer to move over to his office, and I accepted. And we were still in session, and I started that December of 1980. I started actually going to meetings with Senator Nunn.
Even though you,
I was still on the payroll of Senator Talmadge's office.
Right.
I was just looking at something. We're moving offices here to a different floor, so I'm cleaning out the office I've been in for 21 years. And I have in there a pencil, a wooden pencil holder with pens, with a plaque on it that was given to me by Senator Nunn's office when I left him, and it says December 1980 to September 1986, even though I didn't actually go on Senator Nunn's payroll until January of 1981. And so I went to a number. I remember going and having meetings with a dozen Democratic senators, Ted Kennedy and David Boren and Bennett Johnson, accompanying Senator Nunn to a variety of meetings. There was this labor bill they were trying to work out something to get it passed in the lame duck session. Mm-hmm. So then I went over to Nunn's office in January, officially went over and moved into the space in January of '81. And Richard Ray was his chief of staff. Mm-hmm. Richard and I worked very well together. Richard was a great meter and greeter of constituents who would come into the office. If you got into legislative issues, he also was good at saying, let me get Randy in here to talk to you. He didn't try to be the legislative director, which was good. The one thing I had told Senator Nunn would be something I would ask if I was going to accept the job to be his new legislative director, was that I had control, autonomy to run the legislative department, that I would report to him and I didn't have to worry about anybody interfering with my running of the legislative department, which was about 10 people. So I went there, and for 6 years I had a great time working with him. Senator Nunn kind of looked up from his primary assignments of armed services and national security, international issues, and his government affairs permanent subcommittee on investigations work, which he loved and was really good at. He kind of looked up from all of that in the first quarter of 1981 and said, holy smokes, Herman's gone. And all of a sudden, I've got to take care of agriculture in Georgia. And I've got to take care of these other things that Herman was taking care of.
Right.
And so having someone who had been in Talmadge's office that was familiar with working the tax and trade and healthcare issues in the Finance Committee, and someone who was familiar with agriculture, I think he valued my background, not only my educational background, but my background with Talmadge, made it an easier transition.
Now, how would you compare Senator Nunn to Senator Talmadge in their style and temperament and managerial style, political style, that sort of thing?
Well, Talmadge, of course, been around a long time, and he knew who his people were, right, down in the States. Senator Nunn was still, he was not a freshman when I joined him, but he was 8 years in to the Senate when I joined him, 8 years. So he's in his second term. Senator Nunn is always very adverse to any criticism that might come his way. So he's very careful, measured in his actions, wanted to be sure that he wouldn't be criticized about positions that he took, or his his personal life. He was, because of Talmadge's problems with alcoholism and Talmadge was from a totally different era in the Senate, and Talmadge's criticism by the Atlanta papers about his real estate deals and things. Senator Nunn was wanted to be very careful ethically. That was always a big issue with him. He wanted to be sure he was doing things appropriately. So as his chief counsel, I had to help him with those things as well, to be sure, okay, if you're taking this trip or you're doing this is all appropriate under the rules, those kind of things.
So you did legislation as legislative director, but you were also sort of
I was also his legal. I was his
ombudsman.
compliance and legal counsel.
Okay.
In-house legal counsel, right. I mean, I didn't handle any of his personal legal matters, but anything to do with his Senate office and his work as a senator.
Sure.
He wanted to be sure he was doing it appropriately. Senator Nunn, they both were big readers, but Senator Nunn was very studious. You know, he got teased, or pundits or national journalists would call him owlish or something like that, you know, because of the way he looked or whatever. But he was a student of whatever. He would really dig in and learn the subject of whatever he was working on, and I would say that has continued throughout his life.
Sure.
I mean, as a board member of all of these major corporate boards that he served on since he left the Senate, he has always, in my impression and from what I've heard, dug in really to learn that entity, to learn the subject matter, whatever it is. And with things like the Nuclear Threat Initiative and all these other things that he's done, he has remained so active in learning, keeping himself up to date. And he would take home a briefcase full of reading material every night, and sometimes he wouldn't get through all of it, and he wanted details about every meeting that he was going to have the next day. So part of my job was to see that my legislative staff, if it was a healthcare issue or a labor union issue or an environmental issue, that whoever the legislative assistant was that responsible for that topic area had prepared materials for him to read that night before the meetings the next day. Sometimes it was more than he ever could get through.
Oh, sure.
And frankly, more than he needed, because his instincts were always good, and because he relied so much on his colleagues. I mean, senators rely on each other for a lot of their, or at least in that era they did, whether they were Republican or Democrat. If it was a Southern agricultural issue, Senator Nunn would rely on Howell Heflin from Alabama and Thad Cochran, a Republican from Mississippi, and they would talk because the issues were pretty much the same. I mean, Senator Nunn told me soon after I became his legislative director, he said, "Go sit down with Lawton's people and Bennett's people. There's no need for us to duplicate effort. We're now in the minority." We went into the minority in '81, and so the whole time I was with him, we were in the minority in the Senate. So we had less staffing in the committees. So he would say, "Go sit down with Bennett and Lawton," who were some of his very best,
Childs
from Florida, Bennett Johnson from Louisiana, and David Pryor from Arkansas. So there was this group of Southern Democrats, and his point was, Lawton is the budget committee guy. Go talk to his legislative director and get information from them. Or Bennett is the energy committee guy. Get information from them on these issues. Now, there sometimes were geographic differences, just as Talmadge had to disagree with Russell Long and Bob Dole on things because Georgia was a consuming state on oil and gas. Texas and Kansas and Louisiana were producing states on oil and gas. There's consuming states in some instances and producing states. And so Bennett Johnson from Louisiana had different views sometimes about energy issues than Georgia might.
Right.
But generally, his point was, let's pool our efforts, because he would talk to those best friends of his that he thought were like-minded with him. Now, sometimes that crossed the aisle. Pete Domenici and he were great friends. Pete Domenici was a Republican, later chair of the Republican chair of the Budget Committee.
From New Mexico. Right?
From New Mexico. And so, but they were conservative, moderate conservative Democrats and kind of moderate Republicans, maybe more conservative on some social issues on the Republican
Sure.
side than some of the Democrats, but there was a group of them in the middle. And Reagan had taken over as president, and there was a group that emerged in the House called the Boll Weevils.
Right.
Kent Hance, and some of them ended up flipping and becoming Republicans, but they would meet, and they were very high profile. The Boll Weevils would meet, a precursor to what would now be called the Yellow Dog Democrats group in the House. I think there's still a group there.
Oh, the Blue Dogs.
The Blue Dogs,
Blue
yeah.
Dogs.
Yellow Dog is a South Georgia term.
Yeah.
The Blue Dog Democrats.
Yeah.
The Democratic senators, about a dozen of them in the Senate, we started meeting, and our staff started meeting every week or two. But the senators were adamant that they didn't want to be named a group. And so we wouldn't have a set schedule of when we met or where we met, because they didn't want the media drawing attention to this group of moderate, they weren't all Southern, but Dennis DeConcini, David Pryor, David Boren, Lloyd Benson, the group, Lawton Childs, Fritz Hollings,
Right.
Bob from North Carolina would have been, well, I don't know by then. That's what, because
that seat turned over.
that
so
seat,
much.
well, that seat changed because that was when John East got elected. And it only made 4 campaign appearances, and most North Carolinians didn't even know he was in a wheelchair. He was they called him Helms on Wheels because he was Jesse Helms junior guy, and that was a common thing. They dubbed him Helms on Wheels because he was Jesse Helms' younger colleague and was in a wheelchair. And so we would have these meetings of the Southern group. Now, pertinent to today and this debt limit fight, and all of a sudden Republicans in the House are caring about the deficit all of a sudden now that they didn't when Trump was president. We would, on the budget resolution, we would go to the floor of the Senate in those first couple of years when I worked with Senator Nunn and offer a balanced budget amendment now, it would raise some taxes, it would make some changes, or it didn't specify the details, but it would say this is how much we're going to raise, because the budget resolution just sets the framework.
Right.
It would say we're going to raise this much in additional tax revenue. We're going to make enough changes in the entitlement programs to save this much money, and we're going to make this much change in discretionary spending, so that we can say we've got a balanced budget.
Right.
And I remember once being on the floor with Senator Nunn after they called that vote. Nunn and Boren and maybe Fritz Hollings, I don't remember who all were the primary sponsors of it, offered the amendment, and it got 12 votes. And Nunn said, well, that's a quality vote, because the Republicans would vote against it because it assumed a raising of revenues.
Right.
Democrats on the left would oppose it because it assumed changes in the entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And so nobody would vote for it, even though it was the right thing to do. I just had a session 2 weeks ago, on the federal budget with my class that I teach, the UGA students in the Washington semester program. We talked about all of this, and I got a little bit more opinionated in class than I typically do, and said, this is what needs to happen now, is people on both sides need to realize if we're going to tackle the deficit and start slowing down how much more we add to the national debt, we've got to deal with all parts of the budget. But that's not good politically. It's a quality vote, but it gets 12 out of 100 votes.
Right.
because the American public likes getting 100% of services for 90 cents on the dollar or 80 cents on the dollar.
Right.
Because we all like to go into Target and have a 20% off sale.
That's true. I can't argue with that.
We like 20% off on our government services too,
but
that we don't want to pay for.
Yeah, and this is, you know, an aside that we're you know, but I think it's a good time to ask it. But now that would be a really important block in
well, that's right. That's right. It's too bad that it's too bad you don't have that middle group in the Senate.
Because it's so equally divided that you would need those votes to get things done. You know, you look at Speaker McCarthy and how long it took him to cobble together enough Republican votes.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what they claim. How many billions is it? They say 112 billion. They say they've got to save out of. They want to save out of the budget this year, and where the Republicans in the House to finally, you know, admit that this is where we think we can do it, because it won't pass. They can't pass that.
Randy Nuckolls going on the record.
Well, I just don't. There's too many constituent groups that will come out of the woodwork when they start identifying programs that tally up to that, and if they leave mostly the big entitlement programs, and if they don't tackle revenue. Right.
Because discretionary spending.
People forget that actually the Inflation Reduction Act last year that Biden passed, that the Republicans think is so horrible, actually did reduce the deficit by $300 million. Not a lot, but a little bit, because there's some tax increases in it.
Right.
So you just can't get there without, if you set aside the revenue side, in my opinion.
Now, was that the case with the Republican senators that you worked with back in the Talmadge and Nunn days, that revenue was completely off the table?
Not as much. Now, they didn't vote for the Nunn, Boren, Hollings amendment because they knew it wasn't going to pass.
Right. So why?
But back in the cloakroom, they would say, "Of course we know. We have to have some more revenue."
You think that those cloakroom conversations are the exact same in 2023?
Well, they don't, maybe, but they don't. I don't think they talk to each other. Even within the Republican caucus in the House, I don't think they talk to each other. I don't think the moderate Republicans, the Main Street caucus or whatever it's called, or the New Way group or whatever you want to call them, I don't think they talk to the conservative,
the Freedom Caucus?
Freedom Caucus, and the ones that are even further right than the Freedom Caucus.
Right.
And frankly, I don't think the Blue Dog Democrats probably don't talk enough or at all to the progressive Democrats in the House.
Sure.
Everybody stays in their own little channel, like everybody watches a certain news publication.
Well, sort of in that same vein, but getting back to it, what was your interaction like with Senator Mattingly, who had defeated your boss, who you held in very high esteem? What was your working relationship like with him and his staff?
We had a good working relationship. The guy that I hired to work for me is the junior LA, a guy named Mitch Delk in Talmadge's office. Mitch went over to work for Mattingly. And there were a couple of other people that left jobs in the Senate, the Democratic members that went over and worked for Mattingly. And so I think the Mattingly-Nunn relationship wasn't particularly personally close, but I think our offices worked well together. It wasn't nearly as partisan then as it is now, and we worked on projects together. Senator Nunn was not an earmarker. He didn't like. He came from the point of view of a senior member of the Armed Services Authorizing Committee. So he didn't like appropriators putting directed language into an appropriations bill, take money out of the defense budget and give it to this or that. So he didn't ask for earmarks because he wanted to keep pure on that, I guess. But then he would say, go talk to Lawton's folks and get them to, or Bennett's folks to put that, because they were both on appropriations, get them to put that language in there. And so we got it done.
Principled to a point.
But he didn't have to be the one that asked for it sometimes.
Right.
And Mattingly would ask for it. So in those days, well, in the days after I left Senator Nunn, well, no, I guess it was Mattingly put some language in for on some appropriations, and we would, help.
Right.
We would help guide them sometimes. So it was a good relationship. It wasn't extremely close, but unlike some offices, even back then, like Hollings and Thurman, didn't work together very much. But so the Georgia offices worked okay together. Probably better than okay. We worked pretty well together.
Well, and Senator Mattingly and Senator Nunn would have had significant overlap on military issue. I mean, Mattingly, I think, was Milcom, military construction.
He was maybe, but Mattingly was on the banking committee, as I recall. I can't remember.
He had several plum appointments when he came in as the first Georgia Republican since Reconstruction to hold that seat.
Well, I have to tell a funny story that Talmadge's defeat, after Talmadge's assumed re-election, Will Ball, his last chief of staff, was going to go up and be the staff director of the Senate Agriculture Committee. And I was going to be the chief of staff in the personal office, moved from legislative director to be chief of staff. And of course that didn't happen. But then Will went and worked in the Reagan White House, and he told a story. He's told a story that he, and of course Talmadge and Strom Thurmond were cousins.
Right.
Maddie, Miss Mitt Thurmond, Gene Talmadge's wife, Miss Mitt, was a Thurmond, and she and Strom were cousins. And Senator Talmadge, I don't think ever had, he of course liked his cousin okay, but he didn't have a high regard for his intellect, I suppose, or his legislative interest. They were kind of different in that regard. Mm-hmm. But once Will said that Senator Thurmond, he saw Senator Thurmond in the 116 Club, actually. So Senator Thurmond had been upstairs in a fundraiser, I think, and he came downstairs. This was like summer of '81.
Okay.
And Will, who was from Belton, South Carolina, Senator Thurmond saw Will, or I'm sure Will said hello, Senator Thurmond, and Thurmond recognized Will as having been Senator Talmadge's last chief of staff, and Thurmond said to Will, "Now what is that boy's name that defeated Herman?" And this is 6 months after Mattingly's been in the Senate. Maybe we should delete that from the tape.
No. I think that's.
Of course, Thurmond served till he was 100 years old.
Yeah. Maybe more. He might have.
No, I think he was just about 100 when he died. But his office was Hollings' office was right down the street. Talmadge and Nunn were right across the hall from each other.
Right.
Until Nunn moved to the Dirksen building.
Right. Because I don't know if it was Rogers, Wade, or it may have been General Panaro telling the story, but no, it was definitely Rogers, because Rogers would go and grab Arnold to take pictures whenever dignitaries or constituents would come by.
Well, see, Arnold started as assistant press secretary to Roland McElroy.
Right. But he was over in Talmadge's office so much taking pictures that Senator Talmadge thought that Panaro was on his staff. Mm-hmm. and Senator Talmadge called Rogers to have him come in. He said, no, he's in Europe with Senator Nunn. He's like, why is he in Europe with Senator? He's like, well, Senator, he works for Senator Nunn.
Yeah, he thought he worked for Senator Talmadge.
Right. He just thought he was one of the staffer in his office.
Well, sometimes Nunn was great to work with too. He never would embarrass you or berate you in any way in public.
Right.
Now he
was that common?
More than I wish it was. Maybe they just treated staff badly. A lot of them have their own personal,
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of senators have that reputation. But I did see some in committee meetings and things where they would really chew out a staffer or kind of undermine what the staffer tried to just say or do, and that's not right, or I didn't agree to that, or something.
Just
like
throw
that.
them under the bus.
Throw the staffer under the bus. None would never do that. And when his full briefcase would go home at night, and come back, and Rose, his secretary, would unload the briefcase and distribute back memos that had been put there. Sometimes there were not any markings on the memos, and you couldn't tell whether they'd been read or not. And I finally told him one time, and because he wanted so much material. Sometimes I felt like he was so good I didn't really feel like he needed, and sometimes I would maybe not give him as much as that he might have wanted, because I knew he didn't really need all of that reading material.
Sure.
He knew what to do or knew what the issue was already. But that was, if I made that judgment call, and he didn't like it, that would be on me, not on the legislative assistant that worked for me. But if there was a memo,
right.
I told him one time, I said, I want you to mark on everything, so that legislative assistant that has put a lot of effort into writing this memo, doing research, they know you've read their memo. I don't want them to be unsatisfied or
why am I working
why
on
am I
this?
doing this? I don't even know whether he read it or not.
Right.
And he had a way of working. Talmadge they have a way of thinking of people for certain things. So Arnold was the military guy.
Sure.
Randy was everything else. Roland or Richard were the constituent services running the office, okay? And then the press secretary handled the press. So Ed Nagy or Scott Maxwell or whoever the press secretary was handled the press issues. So an issue would come up, and sometimes a vote would come up, and he'd call from the floor. If it was my number 2, Ralph Petta, who handled that issue, none wouldn't call him usually. He'd call me. I mean, I remember one time coming in, I'd been at the 116 Club. That's come up a lot today since you guys went there.
That's right.
But I came in from having lunch at the 116 Club, and the bells were going off, meaning 5 minutes left on the vote. And all of a sudden, my phone rings. Or no, I hear the bells. First, I walk in the legislative department where all of us sat, and I had an office in the back of the door, and everybody else kind of sat out front. And I heard the bells going off, meaning there's a vote. And I yelled to Ralph, my number 2, Ralph, what is this vote? And he was able to tell me, because he's been sitting there at his desk, maybe eating a sandwich at lunch. And about that time, my phone rang. And it's Nunn calling from the floor, tell me, Randy, what is this vote? And I was able to take what Ralph had given me quickly, plus my general knowledge of what is going on, and how people that are aligned philosophically with him probably going to vote. I was able to explain to him what I thought it was and what he probably needed to do, what have we heard from Georgia, the constituents, all of that. And I hung up the phone, and Ralph says, you son of a gun, he thinks you've been sitting here the whole time, and you've been gone for 2 hours, and he thinks you've been sitting here the whole time. And so I had to rely on them. But when Nunn would call me and say, come in here about a subject, and if I went into his office and he wanted to talk in depth about some topic that was a little bit out of his expertise, or maybe a little bit out of mine, I would say, okay, Senator, hold on a minute, let me get Jan in here. She's the one that's handling that education issue, or she's the one handling that healthcare issue. So I always wanted to get them in front of him and with me, so that he realized that I didn't know all these
So
things.
you knew a little bit of everything.
My job was to know a little bit of everything, just like that's his job.
Sure.
To know a little bit of everything. And then we had the subject matter expert.
Right. Like Arnold on.
Well, Arnold had a whole staff. Arnold probably did the same thing on military issues, because he had a whole team of people in the Armed Services Committee, and Arnold knows a little about lots of things, and would pull in David Lyle or this person or that person that were the staffers on the Armed Services Committee.
Right.
For the various topics.
So was that sort of a typical day in Senator Nunn's office, what you've described, which is, meeting with constituents, briefing on, getting those memos back in the morning, and
answering the mail, answering the phone calls. I would have a full slate of my own meetings.
Right.
People that didn't get onto his calendar, or didn't even try to ask.
So there were different tiers of.
Right. I mean, there's only so many.
There's only so many hours in a day.
Right? And plus, Senator Nunn, he was very protective of his time. Sometimes he would say, I don't have enough time to read and think. And that would be times when he would get tired of a lot of meetings, and those are not, go through the day and you've got every 30 minutes a meeting with a different group, constituent groups and things, and then you've got caucus meetings, you've got committee meetings, you've got all these things. You're running to the floor to vote.
Right.
He liked to protect some time for him to just think and read and get through that briefcase full of reading materials.
Right.
Particularly because as he got more senior on the Armed Services Committee, as he was preparing for a hearing in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, where he would be chairing the hearing.
Right.
There's a lot of preparatory work that he would want to do so that he could be a good chair of the meeting, could ask good questions, could read the materials that Eleanor Hill and the others in the staffed him there in that subcommittee, because they were doing serious, heavy stuff sometimes.
Right.
And investigations. And so he would have a whole series of meetings. The legislative assistants would have meetings. I would have meetings, cover things that he couldn't do. One of the more fun things I did with Senator Nunn, I didn't do this with Talmadge, but one of the fun things I did with Nunn over the course of the 6 years, I guess I was his legislative director longer than anybody in terms of just the length of time.
Right.
159 counties.
That's right.
The senior senator could not get to every county in the state, even in a 6-year period. So during recess periods from the Senate wasn't in session, I would get two or three times I did this. I would get the field reps in the various field offices in the state, Senator Nunn's office, to arrange an itinerary for me to fly down and go to little towns and communities where Senator Nunn had not been in the 6 years since his last re-election.
Right.
Or in my, and I would, they'd set up, I'd talk to a radio station, be interviewed on the radio, I'd go to a Ruritan Club meeting, I'd go to a Chamber of Commerce meeting and be their speaker. So the field rep would set up a 3 or 4 day travel trip for me, and they would go with me, and that gave them the chance to go into that little community, Thomaston, Georgia, right, or Thompson, Georgia, or other places, smaller places, and I would be a speaker. They would say, oh, the Senator's Chief Counsel and Legislative Director is coming down from Washington.
Right.
And so that was fun for me. It can be exhausting for a member of Congress or to go do that for 6 years in a row, or a member for 2 years in a row to get around to their district. But for me to do it once or twice a year was fun,
Right.
you know, and get to act like I knew things, talk about things that I knew a little bit about,
Right.
as you say, and probably knew a lot more than the average constituent did about
sure.
it.
One would hope
Hopefully,
anyway.
one would hope, yeah, hopefully. And so those were fun. And then working on some legislation that Sir Nunn let me work on legislation that he was outside his committee jurisdictions. And so the 85 Farm Bill, Reagan was president, and
This is the heart of the farm crisis era.
farm crisis. The Senate Ag Committee, chaired then by Jesse Helms, Republicans, reported out because of the farm state Midwestern senators, they reported out a bill that was more expensive than Ronald Reagan wanted. Okay.
Right.
But because they were supporting their support programs, their wheat and their corn soybean programs, even though Reagan wanted to change some of those programs to save money. And so all the Democrats and two or three of the Republicans, or maybe Helms, maybe not Helms, but Mark Andrews and some others from the Midwest voted for a bill too expensive for Reagan's taste. Bob Dole tied up the floor of the Senate in an amendment tree because so that nobody could get up and ask for a vote on the bill. They started debate on the bill, and then, but Dole didn't want somebody to get up and ask for a vote because it would have passed. The more expensive bill would have passed.
Sure.
So he tied it up in an amendment tree, and then Dole and his guy John Gordley, on behalf of President Reagan, started meeting with Democratic senators from the South and saying, what do you want in a streamlined Reagan version of a farm bill, but we'll give you something, we'll give the Southern agriculture some things, and we'll save some money out of the Midwest on some of the other farm programs. So Pryor and Johnston wanted issues on sugar or rice, and others wanted, well, none, we had a lot of erodible land in Georgia, marginal land, that was being planted in these crops that just couldn't compete against the Midwest crops.
Right.
Our soil just wasn't as fertile, and so they would put all these inputs into the production and not get as much out, nearly enough out of it. So our idea was and Reagan was talking about a conservation reserve program to pay farmers to take marginal land out of production. And what we wanted to be sure was that the CRP, if it came to be part of the Reagan plan, we wanted tree planting to be part of that. And so I worked with the Department of Agriculture and with Dole's guys, and we came up with language that said at least 1 million acres of the 30 million acres has to be eligible for planting pine trees in the South. And that was what Nunn's ask was. And so several of these other Southern Democratic senators had a similar ask that benefited their state.
Right.
And in the end, then Dole called up the revised version that had all these goodies in it for the Southern Democrats, and Reagan's version passed, much to the dismay of D. Huddleston from Kentucky, who was the ranking Democrat on the committee, and was not happy with all of us that we kind of abandoned the Democratic bill that came out of the committee, out of a Republican committee. And of course later
Did Mitch McConnell
Mitch
benefit from that?
Mitch McConnell had the famous ad with a hound dog looking for D. Huddleston. Where's D? Because he missed a bunch of votes. And so the famous McConnell ad was looking for like something out of what's that movie with Paul Newman? The dogs are hunting for the
Cool Hand Luke.
Cool Hand Luke. It's like the dogs looking for Paul Newman. They were looking for D. Huddleston,
right?
And he got defeated. Yeah.
Back to that bill. What sort of impact did that bill and the incentives that Senator Nunn secured have on the timber industry in Georgia, or was that just sort of
we planted a lot of pine. You could talk to the Georgia Forestry Commission.
Sure.
We planted a lot of pine trees on land that had previously been, and farmers would bid how much they were willing to take per acre to take it out of production and plant it in pine trees.
Right.
And so now the fertilizer people weren't as happy about it because it meant less fertilizer being sold because they were planting it in trees rather than soybeans or cotton or something. But it was a good program. I think Nunn was proud of it. We passed the changes to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area from Lake Lanier down through Atlanta. That was one of the things I was most proud of working with Nunn. Bob Kerr, who was then the head of the Georgia Conservancy, came in and we rolled out maps on a big table, and there were certain land along the river that had been designated for protection but not purchased by the federal government yet.
Right.
So it was, and some of that had been developed, and so that needed to be taken out of the park. And then there were some other properties that we wanted to designate to be within the boundaries of the park that were then be subject to protection, or subject to being purchased by the federal government.
Uh-huh.
So we drafted this bill, had the Legislative Council draft it. Nunn had said, you work on it with Bob Kerr. You just whatever you work on with Bob Kerr, just come keep me advised what's going on.
Sure.
So we got the bill drafted. The subcommittee chairman in the Environment and Public Works Committee was a guy named, for public lands, was a guy named Malcolm Wallop from Wyoming. He was opposed to any more redesignation of park boundaries because he said there's a whole backlog of land that has not been purchased yet. We're never going to have enough money to purchase all this land. So why are we designating more potential boundaries changes?
Let's deal with the backlog.
It was a Reagan era. He didn't want to spend money, so or even designate potential land. I told Nunn, I said, Wallop, and I've been working with Wallop's subcommittee staff guy, a little guy that looked like Danny DeVito, Tony, I don't remember his last name. Little short, round guy, wore a belt and suspenders. The
things you remember.
But he was a nice, smart guy.
No doubt.
He said, my boss doesn't want to move your bill because you want to designate more land. And so I went back to Senator Nunn and I said, he said, well, figure something out. Let's do whatever you need to do. And I said, okay. So I called up Leonard, who was the head of Environmental Protection Agency in the state of Georgia.
Uh-huh.
Well, first I went to Tony, Danny DeVito, and I said, would you go to Georgia with me? And he said, okay. I mean, it's a little junket for him to go travel down. And I said, go down and let's look at the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. We got this great, what used to be the Ramblin' River Raft Race. Used to be put thousands of people out there on the river every summer. I said, go down there with me and at least look at the park. So he agreed. And then I told the head of the Environmental Protection in Georgia, I said, would you send a helicopter to the Atlanta airport? This is the old Atlanta airport before it was redone. I said, send a helicopter to the Atlanta airport. Tony and I are going to fly down, and I want to fly Tony up the river in a helicopter. So we took off for the helicopter from the Atlanta airport. We flew up to Gainesville. I showed him the river and the river corridor. And then we landed somewhere there on the river. I don't remember exactly where. And we got him out on a National Park Service boat, and we rode him on the river and showed him all of everything. And he and I flew back to Washington. And a couple of weeks later, he called me and said, okay, we're going to move your bill. And so we passed it in the Senate. They passed it in the House. Ellett Levitas, who died recently, congressman from Georgia and my former law partner, was very instrumental in the first. This was the one I worked on was the second version of it after amending it, but Ellett, I think, had worked on the original passage of the Chattahoochee River Park and then was involved in the amendments to it, and we got it done. So that's the kind of thing that was really fun in Senator Nunn's office. He would allow me, and the one that I always talk about that is a University of Georgia item. This was early on with Nunn, the first couple of years. Bill Flatt, the dean of the College of Agriculture then, and still alive in his 90s, great guy, given a lot of money to UGA, he's a wonderful guy. Bill called me and he said, we have this property down in Savannah. It's the Bamboo Research Station. And he said, we need to upgrade the buildings, but we don't own it. We are leasing it. It's leased to us by the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But it had been a research facility for the federal government from the late 1800s up until like the 1940s or 50s, and then they abandoned whatever bamboo research they were doing in other, I guess, Asian horticulture. And they didn't need to do that anymore. So they leased this property north of Savannah, just a few miles, to the University of Georgia, and we were using it as a horticulture research facility administered by the College of Agriculture. They had some buildings and property. Federal government would not put money into it because they didn't want it or care, and the Board of Regents couldn't put money into it because we didn't own it. So we couldn't update the buildings. And so Dean Flatt came up. I said, well, come up and we'll have a meeting about it. And we reached out. I reached out to the Secretary of Agriculture's office, a guy named John Block in the Reagan administration. And I said, would you come over and have a meeting in Senator Nunn's office? So the Secretary of Agriculture came over to Senator Nunn's office and met with Dean Flatt and myself and Senator Nunn. And the Secretary said, if I could give you this piece of property, I would. But I don't have that authority. He said there's something called the Surplus Property Act, which basically says that you can give things away that the federal government no longer needs to the state or local government. But Reagan had come in and he had issued an executive order that said before you put something through the Surplus Property Act process, you have to first try to sell it to the private sector. It was a Reagan philosophy.
Sure.
Sell it to the private sector for development before you just give it away. And so Secretary Block says, I don't have the authority because of that executive order otherwise I'd give it to the Board of Regents. And so we had a cordial meeting and he went back down to Ag Department. And a week or two later, I told Senator Nunn, I said, I think I'm going to write an amendment. And he said, what about? And I said, we're going to give the Secretary of Agriculture the authority to give us that piece of property. And so I had the Legislative Council drafted up, and there was a supplemental appropriations bill about to come to the floor. So I got the language that said, notwithstanding any other provision of law, the Secretary of Agriculture shall have the authority to give away the bamboo research station property to the Board of Regents, the state of Georgia. And I met with Senator Stennis and Senator Hatfield, the chair and ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, and I said, this is what Senator Nunn would like to offer on the supplemental appropriations bill. And they said, Sam wants it, that's fine, it's a home state thing in Georgia, that's fine with us. Approved it. It was set to, they were having the votes on the floor of the Senate that morning, and Senator Nunn was scheduled, he knew he was supposed to come to the Senate floor to offer his amendment, and I was sitting on the back sofa, Senate chamber, and he didn't show up, and he didn't come, and they're about to get to final passage on the bill. And I could see that they're winding up. They're going to have the yeas and nays on final passage of the bill. Because most of these amendments are going through on voice vote because they've all been cleared by the committee. Right. And they're getting down to the bottom of the barrel of the amendments. And I went over to Senator Stennis's guy, Frank, and I said, would you get Senator Stennis to offer this amendment on behalf of Senator Nunn? And he said, okay. He said, we've cleared it. And I said, I don't know where Senator Nunn is. He was supposed to come over to the floor and do this, but he's not here.
This is pre-cell phone days. You have no
idea. Well, you don't have cell phones or anything like that then. And so Senator Stennis gets up and says, on behalf of Senator Nunn, I offer the final amendment to transfer this bamboo research station thing. And bang, bang, it was on voice vote, it passed. So I went back to the office, Dirksen building, and finally Senator Nunn came in, and he's standing there kind of in the hallway between his office and where Rose, his secretary, sat, and I came in where he was, and I said, where in the heck have you been? And he said, why? He said, I was over in, he said, I got caught in this intelligence committee briefing, classified briefing. We was running long, we couldn't leave. It was all in classified information. And I said, well, I passed your amendment today. And he said, what's that? Well, you're giving away land to the University of Georgia? And I said, yes, sir. And I was proud that I had done it. And today, next month, March, I am going to the Coastal Georgia Botanical Garden at the historic Bamboo Research Station north of Savannah. I have never been there, and it's been 40 years since that happened. And I'm going down there with some extension agents. It's under the jurisdiction of the Cooperative Extension Service. And from all that I've read, they have all kind of family events out there. It's a botanical garden. They have all kind of public events out at this facility now. And so I'm excited to actually go see it for the first time.
I'm looking forward to the dedication of the Randall Nuckolls Pavilion.
No, they don't need to do that. I'm gonna try to reach out to Senator Nunn and see if he wants to go with me. I don't think he's seen it either.
Right.
And if he's at home down at Sea Island, then it'd be easy for him to drive up there.
Yeah. Well,
so that was fun.
Right, that's a sort of a bookend to your career in the Senate.
Right, that was fun, and I look forward to going and seeing it. And Arch Smith, the former state 4-H leader in Georgia, who just stepped down as state 4-H leader last year, who now has come back in a temporary role as Southeast Georgia Extension Coordinator, Extension Director. He has jurisdiction over it now, and he's going to take me over there, so that'll be fun.
That's great.
Yeah. So those kind of things that you did without your boss that are not without, you had to do it with your boss's support, but that weren't big national issues is my point. That were home state issues were the things that I'll always remember in Senator Nunn's office is the most rewarding in some ways. Because it helped the state.
Did you ever have any interaction with the campaign staff as legislative director, or was that never the twain shall meet?
Well, I mean, yes. Let's see. Nunn was up for re-election in '84 while I was there. It wasn't much of a. It wasn't much of a re-election. I mean, it wasn't. He wasn't seriously.
I don't even know who he ran against.
He wasn't seriously challenged.
I'm trying to think if anybody actually even.
I mean, I remember with Talmadge in the '80 race, we were writing. I was writing kind of summaries and helping develop summaries of all of his legislative accomplishments. But I don't remember much about working with the campaign, and other than going maybe to a few campaign events or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even know if the Republicans qualified again.
Well, there was. I'm sure there was an opponent, but it was not a serious. It was not a. He never had a serious. I mean, he was very concerned about his first re-election in '78.
Sure. And lots of Democrats did go down in '78. So.
But after '78, he didn't have. Yeah. Now, what would be interesting to me is if he had not decided to leave the Senate in '96, how long he would have been able to stay without serious Republican challenger. I think he would have had a tougher time as time went on. But I still think he was so well respected that of course now there's not a senator in the Senate from the '70s when Pat Leahy retired last year. Dianne Feinstein is the longest serving senator on the Democratic side, and then but she's not Patty Murray is the pro tem.
Right.
And Chuck Grassley was elected in '78.
Right.
No, that's not right. He was elected in '80. Grassley was elected in '80. So there's no senator now who served with Herman Talmadge.
That's right. That's right.
And there's only, I looked the other day, there's only like 5 senators that served with Sam Nunn.
Wow.
And that's shocking to me.
Well, yeah, because Feinstein and Murray were both 92.
Feinstein and Murray and Mitch McConnell
was 84.
And Ron Wyden was elected in January. I don't remember what happened there, but he was elected in January of '96. And there's maybe one other.
Was that Packwood that? Was Packwood
maybe
Oregon?
Packwood's. I don't remember in Oregon what happened, but anyway, Wyden was elected in an off-year election, and so. But there's only about 5 of them, that served with Sam Nunn, which is just.
Well, the dean of the Georgia congressional delegation, Sanford Bishop, now that's 92.
Yeah, so Sanford's been here 30 years, so I remember when Sanford came.
Right. So, time flies.
It's just hard to think about.
Yeah.
That and you see every day that when I can't sleep at night, or if I'm looking online, you look at Wikipedia or something and look at the oldest living senators, either current or former. I used to have that in my head who it was. I think now it's a guy from New York that served like 1 term.
D'Amato?
No, before D'Amato. But anyway, I'm not thinking of him right now. But Nunn was barely on the list, and now Senator Nunn is like pretty moving on up, because Senator Nunn will be 85 this year.
Yeah. So
young Sam Nunn will be 85 this year.
Right.
And he's still very, vibrant and still very active. He tells a funny story about he's done all this nuclear disarmament issues to keep, and the whole nuclear threat initiative, but he would work on things with Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and Bill Perry, and sometimes former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And they would sometimes pen op-eds together, the 4 of them. or speak at a conference, the four of them. And once upon a time, George Schultz's wife said, "George, you got to get some younger people involved in all of this." And he said, "Well, we have Sam Nunn." And of course, Nunn was the young kid in that group. Now Kissinger's almost 100. Schultz has died since then, and Bill Perry has died, I believe, or I can't remember if he has or not.
I think Perry's still alive.
Perry may be, but Perry's considerably older than Nunn.
Right.
And so he may be over 90.
Wow.
And yeah, Nunn is.
I'm almost
so
40,
you look at that list of senators that all were here with Nunn.
Yeah.
Then my almost 10 years in the Senate, I look at that list, and a lot of them are in their 90s now, or upper 80s.
Right.
If they're still alive. So.
How much stock did you put behind the Sam Nunn for president sort of drive, boomlet in '88?
He was very close. He was very close to. I don't know who you've talked to.
I think only Arnold I've really talked to.
Or Roland or Arnold. I left in '86. Roland left in '86. We left the same time, but we were being called back in '87 and '88 to meetings about, is he going to run for president?
To potentially assemble staff, or just
it was just
sound it out?
It was his kitchen cabinet, if you will, of current and former staffers.
I see.
Roland and Gordon Giffen and Connell and me and Arnold and people. Charlie Harmon was later in that because he was his chief of staff, and then of course later Bob Hurt. But this was pre-Bob Hurt. In '87 and '88, and Nunn was we were having conversations about it, and I remember a couple of Al Gore's people one time kind of cornered me somewhere in one of the Senate buildings and said, "Now, is he going to run or not?" So, because if he is, Al Gore will not run.
Sure.
He'll defer. But if Nunn is not going to run, then Gore's going to run. Of course, Gore did run and he was third, I guess, in the. It was Dukakis,
Jackson and Dukakis.
Jesse Jackson and Dukakis.
Yeah.
But no, we had quite a number of meetings about that, and actually, finally, the then current staff and Roland was very involved. Said, "You've got to make a decision." And a letter was prepared both ways to go out to Georgians the next day. And the team went to bed, Gordon and Roland and some of them that didn't know what he was going to decide that night. And he finally, the next, say, if you can't say that you really want to do this, you shouldn't do it. And he came in and said, "Send the letter saying I'm not."
Not quite as dramatic as the Mario Cuomo playing on the tarmac, but
yeah,
similar what if.
Well, I don't think that Senator Nunn's a great man, and he would have been a great president, in my opinion. I don't know how he would have fared in primary campaigns. He would have had to deal with the issues of being a Southerner, of his first election.
The '72 campaign would have come up.
'72 campaign would have come up. There would have been a number of issues about don't ask, don't tell, things like that.
Right.
Well, of course, don't ask, don't tell was later, but
right.
That wouldn't have been '87 and '88. That came up in the Clinton years.
92,
but there would have been issues that he would have had to answer uncomfortable questions about.
Is that your same line of thinking? Because I can remember back in 2008 when then Senator Obama from Illinois had won the nomination, and this was that period between, because he and Hillary Clinton went through the entire primary schedule, So this would have been May to July. Who's going to be the VP? Who's going to be the VP? And Sam Nunn's name kept coming up along with Joe Biden and Senator Webb of Virginia and others. Was that just something that trial balloons were being floated, or do you think? And I'm not saying that you have any particular insight necessarily into that.
I don't know how serious the conversations ever were with him. I think if he had been asked to be vice president, it would have been hard for him to say no, or vice presidential candidate.
Sure.
I think if he had been asked by Obama to be Secretary of State, it would have been hard for him to say no. But by that time, then you would have had the Clinton years and the don't ask, don't tell issues,
right?
For him to have to parse through with the progressives on the
sure.
far left.
Sure.
And there were people that were out there, advocating against Nunn getting any kind of position like that because of some of his positions.
Sure, and just how the Democratic Party had changed since 1996, for example, when he had, I guess 1990, which was the last time he was on a ballot. So that's even longer. So, well, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of beside the point of your work with Senator Nunn, but it's something that I've talked about with some of the other folks, and that is looking back at 2021 and January 6th as somebody who has worked and spent so much time in the Capitol, to get your reflections on what it was like watching that sort of event unfold, but also the subsequent investigations and discussions about what happened and what can be done going forward.
Well, watching it that day was just heartbreaking, wrenching. I mean, it was just, you couldn't believe it was happening to the place, whether you worked there or not, but particularly if you had worked there.
Right.
And imagining having been there, I chair this group out of Atlanta, International Business Executives Group, that I put together a fly-in kind of a meeting in Washington every 2 years. And I've taken them to the White House, 100 plus, CEO level people every 2 years that come together for that meeting. And I've taken them to the White House. We've had black tie dinners at the State Department. I've taken them 1 year to the CIA.
Hey.
And at that meeting, I had worked with the CIA staff and said, we've got this group of business leaders from the South coming, and they were working on, they had a new report out at the time, an overt report on the world in, say, 2025. This was in May of 01.
Okay.
And we were supposed to be at Langley 3 hours, I guess, for this briefing, staff briefing. And what the CIA staff didn't know, I hadn't told them, was that I had talked to Richard Shelby's chief of staff, who's a friend of mine. And Shelby was on the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, and I said, the director of the CIA ought to say hello to this group of Southern business leaders, since we're going to be out at Langley at headquarters. And some of them are from Alabama and Georgia and all the southern states. So we're about 25 minutes into this nice presentation about this global report the CIA had released on challenges in the world in the next 20 years. And in strolled George Tenet, the director of the CIA at the time, who had just come from briefing George W. Bush at the White House. And he kind of walks into our room and commandeers the podium. George's a big kind of burly guy. And he says, well, I understand y'all a bunch of Southern business leaders. Welcome to my house, welcome to the CIA. And he proceeds to talk for like 30 minutes. and he says a lot of interesting things. Among them, we pick up a lot of intelligent chatter from our monitoring of communications around the world. He said, we pick up a lot of information. He said, there are people out there that don't like us, and they want to do harm to us in the U.S. And he said, inevitably, at some point in our life, something's going to happen on our shores, as much as we try to not let it happen. Now, that was May of '01, and in September, it certainly did happen. And I still have people, members of that organization, say, he predicted 9/11. And I said, well, no, he didn't predict 9/11, but he talked to us about the real challenges of American security as and how we have not experienced what other countries have with terrorism and violence. And so I've taken those groups to those kind of events. But what happened on January 6th was just so heartbreaking. And this spring of last year, spring of -- I hosted that group again, the group, and we were down at a hotel, and I had Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock speak. I had Senator Tillis from North Carolina speak, and I had a panel of Senate chiefs of staff, and both Democratic and Republican. And one of them was Mark Warner from Virginia's chief of staff. And she had some of the audience almost in tears talking about the day of January 6th and her experience there, and calling child care providers and talking to other friends that were trapped in the building. And I mean, it was certainly a very difficult day for anybody that was a staffer that was working there, and who were, hunkered down in their office or wherever they were.
Because the members were ushered out
well, the members were ushered out into kind of secure situations, but the members were all in the the Capitol building.
Right.
Now, supposedly up underneath the visitor center there, the new visitor center that was built 20 years ago or so, there's underground bunker space there, protected space where members can be protected, just as there was that bunker space at White Sulphur Springs at the Greenbrier. When they built the addition to the Greenbrier in the Eisenhower years, and they built it right into the hotel. And coincidentally, the public spaces of the new addition had one big conference room that held 435 seats, and the other conference room that had 100 seats, just by coincidence. And then now you can, at the Greenbrier, you can go tour the bunkers underneath, where during the Cold War of the 50s, if an atomic bomb had gone off, they would shuttle the members out to the Greenbrier and put them in the bunker underneath because of atomic fallout that might last for weeks or months. It wouldn't be safe to be outside, theoretically. And so there was a way for the government to keep functioning at the Greenbrier in these bunkers. And even they had these, if you ever go there, they have these steel walls, and how they would close it all off. And there was even an incinerator. There is even an incinerator there. If someone died in the bunker, they didn't want to open the walls, and they would just incinerate the body. So it was only it was during the Clinton administration when an investigative reporter finally wrote the first stories about that facility that was built into the hotel at the Greenbrier. And so supposedly, I have no information about that, but supposedly there's some kind of bunker capability there may be other remote bunker
Sure.
capabilities, but there's a bunker capability underneath the visitor center to protect members, at least in the short run,
Right.
if any kind of an attack happened.
But staff members were in offices and
Well, they were in
hideaways
the
and-
offices on the House and Senate side,
Yeah.
right? So they were there, and they, you know, you didn't know how long this attack was going to continue, and would it spread to places beyond the Capitol? You were sitting there probably just stunned by what you were seeing on the TV. We all were.
Yeah.
Just stunned to see our beautiful Capitol building being just, you know, ransacked, or at least it appeared from a lot of the video.
Mhm.
And so there's a lingering feel there about, you know, staff having, I mean, there have been other things, anthrax, mail, and other things. I mean, it was during the anthrax scare in the early 80s, and the Unabomber that was killing folks around D.C., and there was, for the first time in that early 80s era, early 2000s era, excuse me.
Yeah.
Early 2000s era,
Yeah.
when the Unabomber, and it's when I first started an intern program, UGA intern program, so that's how I can guess it, because one of my early interns I sent to the Russell building, and she was exposed, or they had an anthrax scare the day she was in the building, and so we had to take, her parents were concerned, and we had to take her to get the shots, antidote to that. But so there was all these things going on in the around after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a shooter out on the mall, a farmer took a tractor out on the mall, and then there was a Unabomber that killed a bunch of people around the Washington area over a course of a month, shooting from a white van, and killed 7 or 8 different people at gasoline stations and things. It was the first time that around the water cooler, another outdated concept, you talk to your work colleagues, if you're in an office building, about, well, what would you do if there was another attack of some kind? Have you talked to your children about where you would rendezvous with them if you couldn't reach them, if you couldn't call them because the cell service was out? I mean, the whole 9/11 attack had major impact on the psyche of people here. I mean, my wife was a teacher, my daughters were in school, and their building shook from the crash into the Pentagon. They were close enough to the Pentagon,
Wow.
and lots of my daughter's classmates had parents working at the Pentagon.
Sure.
And so that was a major event. Now 9/11, I mean, January 6th maybe wasn't of the magnitude of 9/11 in terms of how many people it impacted, but it was horrific to watch on TV.
Right.
For somebody who had worked in those buildings and walked through those beautiful hallways with the tile floors and everything. And I could see that day as I was walking. Remember when the group comes up and the guard, I can't think of his name, Eugene, whatever his name was, kind of leads them off.
Eugene Goodman.
Eugene leads them down a different hallway away from the doors of the Senate chamber. I mean, they were really coming close to the Senate chamber doors, and he had the foresight to kind of bait them into following him to a different place away from the Senate chamber. And as they came up those steps, I thought, oh my gosh, they're almost in the Senate doors. The Senate doors where I would stand in the big reception room and right off where we call the Vice President's office, where the Vice President can always come and use an office, where the public would wait for a senator to come out off the Senate floor and meet with somebody if you took a constituent over to the Capitol and you waited there in this big receiving room, and that's where they were walking just near there. If they had turned right rather than he led them left, they would have been right at the Senate doors where the senators would just come out normally out off the Senate floor.
And there was the video clip with Senator Romney, who was, those in the crowd were no great lovers of Mitt Romney. He was yards away from being overtaken.
Right.
Well, what do you think about the House Select Committee? And originally there was going to be an independent, sort of 9/11 style commission to review what had happened, and then there was going to be a bipartisan House or Senate committee, and then
I think the committee, the January 6th committee, did an incredibly thorough job of laying out all of the issues and of sharing with the American public a lot of footage and a lot of and laying out a timeline of things that were happening. One question I have is, if Nancy Pelosi had not declined McCarthy's original nominees and instead had accepted a couple of the more, Jim Jordan and I forgot who else he recommended.
Banks.
Jim Banks. If they had actually gone on the committee, would the committee work have been disrupted to the point it was less beneficial to the public to have, or would it have been less capable of being discounted by the Republicans now? In other words, if Jordan had been there on the committee, it might have changed what the committee showed the public, I suppose. The Democrats would have still, the Democrats along with, who am I trying to say?
Cheney and Kinzinger.
Congresswoman Cheney would have still had the majority, so they could have still directed the hearings.
Right.
They could have still put witnesses forth. Now, if Jim Jordan and Banks had been there, they could have been more antagonistic questioners of those witnesses. But if that had happened, how different would the results of the committee findings have been? Maybe somewhat, but would it be more difficult for the Republicans now to say the committee was only a political stunt, kind of a thing? So I don't know. It's a question we can never answer.
Right. And you know,
it's like my question: what if, that I like to ask at cocktail parties now of some of my friends, which is, what if Hillary Clinton had gone to Wisconsin once or twice and maybe have salvaged Wisconsin for herself in the election in 2016? How would the world be different now?
It's one of those questions you'll never know.
We will never know.
Senator Clinton had invested in the caucus process in 2008? That would have closed off Barack Obama's path to victory. So you would have had probably President Hillary Clinton in 2008 after the economic crash instead of Obama. But we could play these games all day, probably.
I pose some of these. In my class, we study the Constitution. We a good bit about the Supreme Court hearings. We'll talk some this week about the hearing tomorrow in the Supreme Court on loan forgiveness. We're also talking about immigration this week, a little bit, one of the topics. But I talked to them about Trump executive orders and those that have been unwound by Biden. I guess my view of the last, I have a couple of broad views, which is the historians will not be very friendly to the first 25 years of the 21st century. The politics in the U.S. will not stand up and look very good 100 years from now.
I'm but one historian, and my colleague, Mr. Stevens, is another. But it's certain. I think it's safe to say this is no second era of good feelings.
That the democracy has held. The Trump did a very good job in tandem. One of the few things Trump and Mitch McConnell worked effectively together on was appointing judges to the federal bench at all levels that will certainly influence the decision making of the judiciary for the next 50 years in a much more conservative bent. But some of those Trump or other Republican judges, which are not as perhaps philosophical as Trump wanted them to be, or they weren't as philosophical generally, they were appointed by Herbert Walker Bush or George W. Bush, are standing up to some of Trump's acolytes' most outrageous claims about elections and about the results of January 6th. An awful lot of the people are being convicted of their role in January 6th attack on the Capitol. I think it was a lot more, I think, wow, a lot of the meetings that were being had about trying to overturn the election are shocking to me to read about in the aftermath. All that guys like Eastman and others were trying to come up with theories under which Trump could oppose the results of the election, and to Mike Pence's credit, and to Mark Short's credit, and to the White House counsel's credit that held off the worst instincts and didn't let Trump replace the Attorney General with someone that wanted to do his bidding or was anxious to gain his favor. The democracy held.
And of course,
the former Attorney General, pretty much has now tried to clean his reputation up in the long run.
Well, in our home state of Georgia,
made a big difference.
Played its role.
Played a huge role on one day before January 6th.
Well, and you know, just
the
leadership, the Republican leadership in the state.
I give Brian and Jeff and the Secretary of State a lot of credit for the way they stood firm against a lot of pressure.
Right. And now there's the special purpose grand jury in Fulton County, which has concluded.
I'm not sure. I think much is going to come out of that in the end. I think they've served a good purpose. I think the prosecutor, she made a couple of mistakes, certainly showing her political stripes with the fundraiser, which got her had to disqualify certain people from being reviewed by her.
Right.
Not that would have made any difference in her findings, but that was not a good move on her part. It kind of, anything you give to the other side, fodder you give the other side, and now this foreman of the grand jury is certainly, in my opinion, talked too much.
That's Georgia law. Once you're,
I understand, but there's a difference in the law and what.
To your point, it's
when Saturday Night Live is all of a sudden making that part of their subject matter and to spoof her.
Right.
It serves the purpose of those being investigated.
It is. I'm sure the district attorney's office is not thrilled.
No, I'm sure she's not.
Well, Randy, we could probably sit here all night and talk about the ways of the world and history and politics, but I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
I've worn you out again.
You haven't worn me out. You'll the only way I'm worn out is because I didn't get to bed till 2:00 in the morning last night because we flew in and the late.
You
the
didn't
late
drive
plane.
this time.
No, no. We drove back. So we flew in last night.
I see.
We got to the hotel about 12:30, 1 o'clock, something like that. My videographer has a very sweet high maintenance dog.
Now, are you?
You want me to?
Yeah. So,
Still going?
I'll wrap it up.
Okay.
So on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library, Randy, thank you so much for your
Thanks.
time and your hospitality here at Denton's. Thank you so much.
Thank you.